video history from the J. Bay Jacobs Library for the History of Obstetrics and Gynecology in America. It's a pleasant May afternoon in New Orleans in the year 1998. And a little apart from our usual format, we're going to talk with two past presidents of the college, Harold Kaminezky, who was the 29th president in 1978 and 79. I've got that right. And
yes, you have.
Martin Stone, who was the 30th president in the following year. We've done individual tapes with these past presidents before. The thought today that we talk about the decision made to move the college from Chicago to Washington, how the decision was made, what were the reasons the decision was made, and what do you see as the after effects from that. Just to recap for no more than a minute, the college was founded in Chicago in 1951 in the office of Dr. Ralph Reese. It occupied 4 locations in Chicago, 2 on South Michigan Avenue in offices that were occupied by Dr. Reese himself and with his associate Don Richardson as he worked for the Central Association. The college then moved to the Bell Savings Building at 79 West Monroe, and then to 1 East Wacker Drive, I believe in 1971 or 1972. It was about 20 years after the founding, and the college had grown to significant size. I came to the college in, as you will all remember, in 1975 with a conviction that the college really needed an office in Washington. And that was established about a year later. And Harold, maybe you could start off by telling us a little bit about the office in Washington and what that went, because you were a leadership figure, I think secretary of the college at that time.
I believe I was secretary at the time. When you came and made the suggestion, I, of course, concurred, felt very strongly, as you did, that we needed to be represented in Washington. As everybody will recall, the impulse to move to Washington was based, at least in large part, by virtue of the fact that Medicare and Medicaid had come into being, that as government began to pay for care, they would, of course, try to regulate the health care for which they were paying. And if they were to hear from an organization that was authoritative about maternity care, they would seek out whoever was closest. As it turns out, there was no medical organization who could project the views for patient care in this area, except for the American College of Nurse Midwifery. And although they were quite authoritative in normal obstetrics, they certainly could not convey our view of patient care in abnormal obstetrics and in gynecology. So I fully concurred with the opening of an office, and as you know, Dr. Irwin Nichols, then Director of Practice Activities, took a small staff from Washington and opened that office and began to interact with the staffs of Congress people when he could get to them, and then with the regulatory bodies in Washington, such as NIH, FDA, and ICHD.
Marty, do you want to add anything to the Washington office era of the late 70s?
Yes, I remember that office. It was really a small office, far from what we ended up with.
444 North Capitol.
Right. And Nick, at the beginning, commuted a little bit between Chicago and Washington. The job quickly grew to where the commuting part stopped, and then we started looking at other things. I don't know whether it was you, Warren, who had the original idea or not, but whoever it was deserves a lot of credit.
Well, I think it grew perhaps as much as anything else.
And I remember the beginning arguments against it were interesting. We were told the organization would suffer from Potomac fever, meaning that
Can you define Potomac fever?
I'll try and catch it. That's all I know. I guess we were immune. The argument was that if we got into Washington, we'd be doing is playing politics and forget our educational objectives. And that kept coming up time and time again. The need was then underwritten by the success of Nick being there in the office and the growing demands on his time, and then a very small staff, for indeed, as Dr. Kaminezky said, the government agencies, people, staff people for Congress learned they had a great resource available, and we just had to fill that need. I think it's been proven to be most successful, and probably we're short of space, even though we have our own Pearse building now. It was interesting. We worked together, 3 presidents in a row, to try and pull this off. We had many, many discussions. I remember one at the very end when Harold came in, and he was so enthused that for a while we didn't know what he was talking about. We said he should have flown on an airplane instead of alone. But the enthusiasm was justified and necessary. And the final vote was not unanimous. Even after it passed, there was still one dissenter at the end, and who wouldn't change it in the usual way of saying, make a motion that we cast one ballot, unanimous ballot.
Rather than identifying
even think
him
of
as
that.
having been wrong, we'll forget.
That's right.
The thing that I remember about the late 70s and with the Washington office was that once Dr. Nick was there, learned shortly that he had to have a lawyer.
Yes.
And then they said they couldn't operate without a library. And then they needed more people, and I think all of us began to foresee a time in which we'd have a large office in Chicago and a large office in Washington, and that was
I
not
think
a
that was one of the
sensible
big points. That was growing so fast when we had the original large office in Washington that became obvious, and I remember the difficulties of the move when you had to pack everything there, and there was a little period of time when nobody knew where anything was. Some was in Chicago, some was in Washington, and usually, as is always the case, what you needed in one place was in the other place.
Harold, tell us something about the process. How did once the thought was there, what did the executive board and the leadership do and have to do?
I decided that as president-elect, and of course with concurrence of the physician staff and other staff members and the 3 presidents with whom I was then associated, that I would make this my initiative for my year as president. And recognizing that we are a very diverse college geographically, that people in many parts of the country would not really feel deeply the impact of Medicaid on their daily practices, that they might wonder why we were trying to relocate the college office, and then that raised the issue of Potomac fever, the diversion of resources, the loss of our emphasis on standard setting or guideline setting in current modern terms, that we would lose that and we would be consumed. Therefore, in order to begin a process of persuasion, I visited as many district meetings as I could.
Advisory councils.
With Dr. Stone visiting some that I couldn't visit, to carry the message of the why. And the why we've already discussed here. The reasons against, beyond Potomac fever, related to the fact that the 2 other major organizations in medicine with which we interacted frequently were the AMA and the American College of Surgeons. For many people, the thought was that we would lose the bond between these organizations, and that might lose us some of the emphasis in the practice of medicine that we enjoyed because of our physical presence.
I just interject for one moment on that. Dr. Nichols and I were called to the AMA one day by Dr. Sammons and his associates and explained that it was not acceptable for us to move to Washington.
That should have clinched it, as far as I'm concerned, that we made the right decision.
Right.
And this then was a series of arguments made to the advisory councils of each district, the why it was important. And even though many, especially those in the more rural parts of our country who were fellows, couldn't feel the impact of Medicaid payment and the regulation that inevitably would follow government payment, nonetheless, the vision was that this would grow. It wasn't reversible, and as it grew, Congress and the regulatory bodies would impact on our practice. And if we really wanted to have the message for good patient care before Congress people, before regulatory bodies, then we'd have to articulate those arguments consistently. Furthermore, and just one more statement in that regard, we had a body of information, namely our book on standards, the small book we had with the American Academy of Pediatrics. We had technical bulletins, we had committee opinions, so therefore we had an authoritative body of information that we could make available as source.
20 years has passed, so I think it's probably not out of line to ask you, as you went around to talk to the various district advisory councils, where did you hear that it wasn't a good idea? What parts of the country thought this was not a good move?
There's a little history on why most of the medical organizations started in Chicago. You could only go by train in those days, and that was Central America, and just about every national organization, from labor unions to scientific organizations of a national level, were in Chicago. And we did get lots of talk the further away we went, particularly on the West Coast, about what a trip that would be for people to come into the college office. Of course, airplanes helped change that. I don't believe anyone goes to Chicago by train anymore for a medical meeting. But that's what we ran into, and it took, I can't remember exactly how long, but maybe a period of 3 years till we got this message across, and it was repeated at district meetings. Gradually, there wasn't any big movement. Gradually, you stopped hearing objections. And Harold's emphasized the Medicare-Medicaid part. We had so much more to offer beyond that, just on the scientific level. And finally, as a matter of fact, it's only recently that we've gotten involved with the AAMC that was in Washington. A very strong reason to be there from the educational point of view. For our practitioners, that wasn't as significant a point. But altogether, the bottom line is nothing succeeds like success. And it's been so successful that we can say that everyone involved made the right decision. I remember you had a committee, and I can't remember who was on that. It's very specific.
There was a task force to look at it.
And also to find a suitable place.
Yeah. Well, we had, as I said, think it, not unfair now to say that the opposition I remember came from the southeast United States.
Yes.
And some from the areas around Chicago who felt we were deserting them and moving east, and it was partly transportation, but partly other reasons as well.
And also some of the people working for us felt that they couldn't move, and they'd be out of what was considered one of the nicest administrative jobs you could have for many of the people in the office.
Harold, you will, or both of you, I'm sure, will remember the meeting at which the final decision was made. Do you remember how it went?
Yes, I think it was, I think I spoke, Marty spoke.
That's the one we're talking about.
And it was rather clear by that time.
Yes.
And, although Marty and I were then president-elect, keep in mind your own emphasis, Nick's emphasis. This was not simply a presidential initiative.
Nick was very strong. We ought to say that.
You're in your own way. You had you certainly weren't going to lead the band because you couldn't as executive director.
But I could show you all the music.
Yes,
and how?
Yes, and show it in a good way so that people felt that it was a reasoned response. And I think the vote was almost unanimous.
It was one short.
As I remember, after what seemed to me like years, actually was about 2 years of discussion and planning. And you presented, Harold, the motion that we should move. Somebody said second, somebody else said I call the question, and everybody voted in favor except one person at that point. The discussion had all been done.
It had all burnt out by then. It went right through it at that time.
y'all want to say something about our location in Washington? And
Well, I think Marty was more involved in the location.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on Washington, but for the many times that I've been there for meetings, it seems to be an ideal location. I'm so glad it's not out in where NIH is.
Okay, that was the point. Go ahead.
We're downtown. You can get there easily from the airport. There are always hotels. We've often used one in walking distance. That makes it easy. The restaurants, which are important, are there, and the access for people going to the Hill also is rather easy. If we were out in Maryland somewhere, it wouldn't have worked as well.
We've worked, as you all will know, with a real estate firm, and I know you all went with us when we looked at
buildings. And when we looked at the building, there was a big empty lot there. It didn't look too well developed. We sort of wondered, but somebody had great presence of mind to get into this area, which has grown and been rehabilitated in some senses around us.
It was our initial location, because not everybody will know when they look at this tape someday. Was at 600 South Maryland, which is just a block south of the Air and Space Museum. Indeed, almost within walking distance.
Almost across the street.
Just about a block away, and almost within walking distance of the House of Representative office buildings. And we finally said, we really need to be within a mile of the Capitol. Otherwise, why not stay in Chicago?
Yeah.
Well, I think we should emphasize that issue of closeness to Capitol Hill to leave some idea of the why. The capacity of a government relations module within ACOG, the people who work day by day, to walk to the Hill very easily, to attend meetings at the Hill, to even attend the parties that are held on the Hill, the kind of interaction that yields up familiarity and then the open door to listen to us. It couldn't be done in a remote location, and therefore, whatever the difficulties of finding the real estate, and I'm sure the additional expense that was involved in a close location was certainly well worthwhile. And I think, therefore, our impact has been magnified to some extent because of that.
20 years has passed, or perhaps have passed, more grammatically. How would you assess what's happened since we moved to Washington as potentially compared to having remained in Chicago?
Oh, Marty, I think it's. I think if we were putting it on a usual scale, it's a 10 by far. Across the board, all the judges would rate it that way. I think even some who were honestly doubtful no longer have those doubts. The number of things we could spend hours enumerating and elaborating on the specific actions that are happening in interfaces with the Congress and their staff. That's something you couldn't do. It's not seeing the congressman, as you both know so well. It's getting to know the staff people at the staff level. I understand it's the clerks that write most of the Supreme Court rulings that get approved or not approved or modified. We sure know that it's staff that does the legwork for the Congress, and we're doing it for them.
Harold, would you?
Yes, I would certainly agree. And I think the other issue is the reputation of ACOG. Because of our presence here, ACOG became a far better known organization. The principles for which we stood and stand have become better known, and our reputation has grown. Part of the government relations issue in giving information to Congress and regulatory bodies is the fact that we were seen not only at the moment as authoritative, but then in retrospect. None of the advice and information we gave appeared to be self-serving to the practitioner, but rather was far more broadly addressed to patient needs.
And it was scientifically based.
Yes.
We had data to support our positions.
And I think the only I don't think another organization had better data that we did based on the refereed literature and good consensus documents. So, been good for us.
Had about 110 employees in Chicago when 1981 came. We offered opportunities in varying degrees to the staff to move to Washington. I think it was 35 people who moved, but it was the key people
Yes.
who came with us. In addition to the physicians, it was the Bill McDaniels, Elaine Locke, Shirley Sheltons, Pam Van Hines, who came with us to Washington. We promptly hired, within the space of a couple months, about 60 more.
How many do we
people.
have now?
Someplace around 230, I would
Well, that's
think,
not too much,
altogether on the staff at this time. There is no question, I think, that you've hit on the high points of it. It was a decision, timely made a decision that, always interesting to me, that a number of other medical societies have rejected. We attempted to convince the American Academy of Pediatrics to move to Washington. They went instead to a location out near O'Hare Airport. The American Medical Association
Can't move.
Can't move, but even then and even now does not have a physician in Washington because they're afraid, in some sense, of some statement being made that might not represent exactly what they believe.
I
in Chicago.
separate us from the AMA in the sense that we are still a learned society, not a union representation of our 30,000 plus colleagues who are certified in obstetrics and gynecology. And I think the greatest comment that could be made is that we didn't catch Potomac fever.
Among the other major specialty societies, if you take the 6 biggest specialties in medicine, only the psychiatrists, along with OBGYN, is located in Washington. The others all have offices here, but are located someplace else. We're further ahead.
And I assume their offices are increasing every year.
The Academy of Pediatrics, I think, is up to 25 or 30 people in Washington and doing it. Well, it was a key moment in the college, and you two gentlemen were the leaders in it, and thank you for joining me today to remember all of it for people in the future.
Thank you for having us here.
I appreciate being here, Warren.